Well, when you think about American historical memory, the Civil War was not, of course, the first event in American history. Certainly the Revolution is also something that lingers and continues to be debated and honored at the same time. But as an example of this transition from historical event to memorial or memory event, can you locate one or two moments in the trajectory of the memory of the Civil War to give us an idea of how that has changed over the course of time?
Well, there are some patterns to these things with huge national turning points, major wars, major pivots in any nation's history. Generally, there's a kind of 20-year pattern, maybe 25 years, which of course means essentially a generation, the transmission of a generation, the generation that experienced the event or the transformation, passing it on to the next as they reach adulthood. And in the case of the Civil War, for example, what we come to call the lost cause tradition, the Confederate legend, if you like, the idea that the South told itself that it was never really defeated, that it didn't really fight for slavery, that it was a noble defense of home and place and family and so forth. That really kicked in the 1880s and 1890s as a huge cultural phenomenon and even as a kind of racial ideology. We can also chart to some degree the course of the memory of the Civil War through monument building, memorialization, the ubiquitous monuments about the Civil War all over American society, especially east of the Mississippi. And then I would just point to, you might point, in the case of the Civil War, you might point to the phenomenon of blue-gray reunions. These were these massive reunions of former Confederate and former Union soldiers. They're veterans organizations, and there were hundreds of thousands of veterans alive and well by the 1890s. It took 20 to 25 years before the attempt at these blue-gray reconciliation reunions were even possible. But once they started happening, they became major commercial events. Cities would compete to host them, including southern cities. And hence by the 1890s, the turn of the 20th century and into the early 20th century, they were major phenomena. And it is at those reunions, probably more than any other place or in any other aspect of American culture, where you can see this culture of reconciliation being constructed around this conception of the mutual valor of the soldiers.
Yet that changed again. The 25 years after that, the surviving soldiers were no longer alive in the majority of the cases, and so another aspect of this memory emerges as much more salient than this idea of reconciliation.
The way to really grasp what historical memory is that one has to find a way to look at the institutions, the mechanisms, and the sources of power within society that do end up controlling the creation of that story. Sometimes those sources of power are schooling and whoever controls curriculums and textbook writing. Sometimes it's publishing. And sometimes it's the political culture, from presidential rhetoric on down through all kinds of other elected officials. Sometimes it's in ritual of all kinds, parades, commemorative activities, how we came to collectively celebrate or commemorate Memorial Day, which of course was founded with the Civil War. Who owns Memorial Day? Who gets memorialized? Who gets the monuments? Just as one simple example, if one ever goes out to try to count or even see the number of Civil War monuments, the vast, vast, vast majority are monuments to that ubiquitous generic soldier standing on the platform, musing, leaning on his musket and musing through his sideburns, as Robert Lowell once put it. They're white soldiers, but they're generic. They're not named. They're just the ubiquitous common soldier, around which both sides could somehow rally, even if it's commemorating a Confederate veteran rather than a Union veteran or vice versa. There were precious few monuments built to the black soldiers, 1/10 of the entire Union forces in the Civil War. There were precious few memorials or monuments of any kind built to slaves and the 250 years of slavery that African Americans experienced. And it was slavery. There's an absolute clear consensus now that slavery was the principal cause of the war, that emancipation was its principal, most far-reaching, pivotal result of that war, along with the preservation of the Union. But we developed a memorial culture, at least from the Civil War, that began to suppress, erase, ignore the racial meanings of that war, erase even the idea that the war had been fought over slavery. And there are many, many reasons for that. And it wasn't just Southerners who did it. This was also done by Northerners, which is where most of the publishing industry was for decades and decades. And then on down to the centennial of the Civil War, nearly 50 years ago, we experienced that pivotal commemoration or anniversary right in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement. And so you had this ironic, almost impossible juxtaposition of trying to commemorate a civil war that was still reconciling North and South at the very time that the South was undergoing, in effect, a kind of racial, legal, political revolution, a second Reconstruction because the first one had not succeeded. It remains to be seen how, as a society, we will commemorate, face, explain that period to ourselves as we approach now the sesquicentennial of that war. But one way to chart historical memory is, of course, through these kinds of anniversaries. 9/11, of course, is so recent that we sometimes are at a loss to know exactly where to put it in time, comparatively, because it is so recent. We know it's important, but we don't know quite where to put it yet.